My mom's boyfriend fell for me, and I had to keep it a secret. Sometimes, love finds you in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it sneaks up on you, crosses boundaries, and forces you to question everything you thought was right. That's exactly what happened to me. I never expected to move into my mom's boyfriend's house. I never expected to look at him the way I did. And I definitely never expected him to look back at me the same way. But once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. This is my story. A story of forbidden desire, of secrets, of a love that was never supposed to happen. But when something feels inevitable, how long can you fight it? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of my stories. If you've ever had to keep a secret like this, let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get into it. Moving into my mom's boyfriend's house wasn't something I had planned. It just happened. My mother, Lena, had been dating Victor for almost a year now. He was wealthy, sophisticated, and had a presence that commanded attention without trying. I didn't know much about him, except that he owned several businesses, had a taste for expensive whiskey, and, despite being at least 15 years older than me, kept himself in incredible shape. At first, I didn't think much about him. He was just another man in my mother's life, another relationship that probably wouldn't last. But when she asked me to stay at his house for a while, something about her needing to travel for work, I didn't hesitate. His house was big, comfortable, and way better than my tiny apartment. But then, I met his eyes for the first time, and everything changed. I had just arrived, carrying my bags inside when Victor stepped into the living room. He was wearing a fitted black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong tanned skin. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his piercing eyes met mine with an intensity that sent a strange shiver down my spine. "You must be Lucas," he said, his voice deep, smooth, and confident. I nodded, gripping my bag a little tighter. "Yeah, thanks for letting me stay here." He smirked slightly. "It's no problem. Make yourself at home." I tried to ignore the way his gaze lingered for just a second longer than it should have. Later that evening, I explored the house. It was massive, filled with sleek, modern furniture, soft lighting, and windows so big that the entire city seemed to stretch out beneath them. Everything about this place screamed control and perfection. Just like him. Victor found me in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. "Getting used to the place?" he asked, leaning against the counter. I turned to face him. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top now, exposing just a hint of his toned chest. It was distracting. Too distracting. "Yeah, it's nice," I said, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt. He watched me for a moment, then reached for a glass, his fingers brushing against mine as he took it from the shelf. It was a simple touch, barely anything, but it sent a current through me that I couldn't explain. Neither of us moved. The air between us felt different, charged. Then, suddenly, he stepped back, as if snapping out of something. "You'll be comfortable here," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. I nodded, but my heart was racing. What the hell was that? That night, lying in my new bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way his eyes lingered, about the warmth of his skin when our fingers accidentally touched. This was dangerous. This was wrong. But for the first time in my life, wrong felt intoxicating. The next morning, I woke up earlier than expected. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft morning light filtering through the large windows. I pulled on a hoodie and padded into the kitchen, expecting to be alone. I wasn't. Victor was already there, sitting at the counter, a coffee mug in hand. He looked different, more relaxed. He was wearing only gray sweatpants, his broad chest on full display, the faint morning light casting shadows over every defined muscle. I froze for a second too long. He looked up, noticing my hesitation, and smirked. "Didn't mean to scare you." I cleared my throat, moving to grab a cup. "You didn't." The silence stretched between us as I poured my coffee. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, like he was waiting for something. Then, just as I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. "Lucas." I glanced back at him. He tilted his head slightly, something unreadable in his gaze. "You're different from what I expected." I frowned. "Expected?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Never mind." I wanted to push, to ask what he meant, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, took my coffee, and walked back to my room. I could still feel his eyes on me. I tried to shake off the way Victor looked at me that morning, but the thought of it followed me all day. His words, his expression, the way he studied me as if I was some kind of puzzle he wanted to solve, it all lingered. I told myself I was overthinking, that he was just being polite, making conversation, trying to get to know his girlfriend's son. But there was something else there, something unsaid. By the time the evening rolled around, I was restless. I needed a distraction, something to pull me out of my own head. I found myself in the living room, flipping through TV channels mindlessly. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the distant hum of the city outside. Victor wasn't home yet. My mother had mentioned something about him working late, but I had no idea what exactly he did for a living. He was successful, that much was clear, but his world was so far from mine that I hadn't bothered asking too many questions. An hour passed, then another, and then, just as I was about to head to bed, I heard the front door unlock. Victor walked in, looking sharp in a black dress shirt and dark slacks. He carried himself with that same effortless confidence, the kind that made it seem like he was always in control, always one step ahead. I swallowed, forcing myself to act normal. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice casual. He looked at me, surprised to find me still up. "You don't sleep early, do you?" I shrugged. "Not really." He smirked, setting his keys down on the counter. "Me neither." There was a pause, the kind that stretched a little too long, filling the room with something thick and unspoken. I should have gone to my room, should have ended the conversation there, but I didn't. "You want a drink?" Victor asked, already moving toward the bar cart near the window. I hesitated. Sure." He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid glowing under the dim lights. When he handed me one, our fingers brushed again, just like in the kitchen. It was barely a touch, a fraction of a second, but I felt it everywhere. I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in my chest. Victor leaned against the counter, watching me with something unreadable in his gaze. "You seem tense," he said after a moment. I let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, it's been a weird couple of days." His smirk deepened, like he knew exactly what I meant. "You'll get used to it." I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Silence settled between us again. Not awkward, but heavy. I could feel the weight of his presence, the way he held himself with that quiet power. It was unsettling and intoxicating at the same time. Then he did something unexpected. He reached up and loosened the top buttons of his shirt, sighing as he rolled his shoulders back. The movement was casual, effortless. But I noticed everything. The way the fabric pulled, the glimpse of tanned skin underneath, the way his collarbone shifted. I swallowed hard. This was wrong. This was my mother's boyfriend. I should have looked away. I should have finished my drink and gone to bed. But I didn't. Victor's gaze flickered to mine, sharp and knowing. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head quickly. "No, just tired." He smirked, but there was something else there, something dangerous. "Right." I drained the rest of my whiskey and set the glass down a little too forcefully. "I should probably sleep." Victor nodded, but I could tell he was amused. "Good night, Lucas." I turned away before he could see how flushed my face was. As I climbed the stairs to my room, my mind was spinning. This was a game. I just didn't know the rules yet. I tried to pretend nothing had changed, that the moment with Victor last night was just in my head, that I was the only one reading into it. But the next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, I knew I was wrong. Victor was already there, dressed casually in sweatpants and a fitted t-shirt, his usual composure effortlessly in place. He looked up from his coffee as I entered, his lips curling into a smirk like he had been expecting me. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, knowing. I swallowed. "Morning." I went straight for the coffee, avoiding his gaze. But I could feel it, his eyes on me, watching, studying, the same way he had last night. "You sleep okay?" he asked, sipping his coffee. I nodded, though it wasn't exactly true. I had spent half the night staring at the ceiling, trying to untangle the knots in my chest. Victor chuckled, and when I glanced at him, his smirk had deepened. "What?" I asked. He shook his head, setting his mug down. "Nothing, just... You're easy to read, Lucas." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, muscles flexing slightly under the fabric. "It means I know when something's on your mind." My grip on my coffee cup tightened. He was pushing, testing, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to fail or pass. Before I could answer, the sound of my mom's voice echoed through the house. She had just gotten home from her business trip. Victor's entire posture shifted. He straightened up, his expression smoothing over into something neutral, casual, like nothing had happened, like there hadn't been an undercurrent of something dangerous between us just seconds ago. And that's when I realized. He was playing a game, and I had just become a part of it. That night I couldn't escape the tension. My mother was home and everything should have gone back to normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. At dinner, Victor acted as if everything was fine. He laughed at my mom's stories, touched her hand when she spoke, played the role of the devoted boyfriend perfectly. But every so often, his gaze would flicker toward me. Just for a second. Just long enough to remind me that I wasn't imagining things. After dinner, I retreated to my room, but sleep refused to come. My mind was a storm of confusion and something else. Something I didn't want to name. Sometime past midnight, I gave up. I slipped out of my room, heading downstairs for water. The house was dark and quiet, the city lights outside casting long shadows across the floor. And then, just as I reached the kitchen, I froze. Victor was there. He was leaning against the counter, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal a sliver of his toned chest. His hair was slightly messy, like he had run a hand through it too many times. He looked up when he heard me, his lips curving into a slow smirk. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened. Victor took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. Funny, neither could I. The air between us grew thick, charged. The same way it had last night, the same way it had at breakfast. I should have walked away, should have turned around and gone back to bed. But instead, I stepped closer. Just enough to feel the warmth of his presence. Just enough to let the tension build, to let the unspoken words between us settle into something undeniable. Victor tilted his head slightly, watching me, studying me. "You sure you know what you're doing, Lucas?" he murmured. I didn't, but I didn't care. The kitchen felt smaller than it was. The silence between us was thick, charged, pressing against my skin like something tangible. I stood there, just a few feet from Victor, knowing I should leave, knowing this was wrong. But I didn't move. Neither did he. Victor took another sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving mine. His free hand rested against the counter, fingers tapping lightly, like he was waiting for me to do something, to say something. I swallowed hard. I should go. His lips curled slightly, but there was something else in his expression, something unreadable. Then why haven't you? I had no answer. The air between us buzzed with something I didn't want to name. Victor set his glass down with a quiet clink, his movements slow, deliberate. Then he stepped closer, just enough for me to catch the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth of his body. My pulse hammered. "You don't look at me the way you should," he murmured. My breath hitched. "And how should I look at you?" His eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous passing through them. "Like I'm your mother's boyfriend." I swallowed, my throat dry. "I do." Victor let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "No, Lucas, you don't." His voice was smooth, quiet, but there was an edge to it, like he was walking the same tightrope I was, like he felt the weight of this moment as much as I did. I forced myself to step back. It was small, barely a shift, but I needed the distance. "This is a bad idea," I whispered. Victor studied me for a long moment, then nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "It is." But neither of us moved, and that was the real problem. The next morning, I tried to act normal, to pretend nothing had happened. But it wasn't just that moment in the kitchen, it was everything leading up to it. The tension, the glances, the way he made me feel like I was balancing on the edge of something I shouldn't want. I wasn't the only one avoiding things. Victor barely spoke to me at breakfast. He greeted my mom with a kiss on the cheek, made small talk about work, but his eyes barely met mine. I told myself that was good, that it meant we were moving past whatever had been building between us. But then, later that afternoon, when my mom went out for errands, I was alone in the house with him again. And suddenly, pretending felt impossible. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he wasn't completely aware of my presence. I hesitated for half a second before speaking. "So we're just ignoring last night?" Victor didn't look up immediately. He let a few seconds pass, then locked his phone and set it down beside him. "Would you rather talk about it?" I crossed my arms, feeling defensive. "I don't know. Maybe." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "There's nothing to say, Lucas." I should have let it go. I should have walked away. But instead I pushed. "So, that was just nothing?" Victor's jaw clenched, and this time he did look at me. His gaze was sharp, heavy. "Do you want it to be something?" I froze. His words landed between us like a challenge, like an open door I wasn't sure I had the courage to walk through. I had spent the past few days drowning in uncertainty, but in that moment, something clicked into place. I didn't just want him to notice me. I wanted him. Victor must have seen the realization in my face, because his expression shifted, his smirk fading into something more serious, more dangerous. "This is a mistake," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I took a slow step forward. "Then stop me." For a split second I thought he would. I thought he'd get up, put distance between us, remind me that this was wrong. But he didn't move. Instead, his hand twitched slightly on the armrest, like he was stopping himself from reaching for me. The tension coiled tighter, wound so thickly between us that it felt suffocating. Then, just when I thought he was going to say something, to do something, the sound of the front door unlocking shattered everything. My mother was home. Victor exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, and in a second, the moment was gone. I turned away quickly, my heart pounding, retreating toward the hallway before my mom could see my face. But as I walked away, I heard Victor let out a quiet curse under his breath, as if he knew this wasn't over, as if he knew we had already crossed a line we couldn't erase. That night I couldn't escape it, the feeling of almost, of what could have happened, of what nearly did. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replayed every moment. The way Victor had looked at me, the way he hadn't pulled away, the way his fingers had twitched, like he was fighting something he didn't want to admit. I had never wanted anything so badly in my life. But I wasn't stupid. This wasn't some harmless crush. This was my mother's boyfriend. And yet, no matter how many times I told myself that, it didn't change the fact that when I closed my eyes, all I saw was him. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal. I went through the motions, brushing my teeth, throwing on a hoodie, heading downstairs like nothing had changed, like I wasn't completely unraveling on the inside. Victor was already in the kitchen when I walked in. He was dressed in a fitted navy blue shirt today, sleeves rolled up, hair perfectly styled like usual, but his movements were different, tighter, more controlled, like he was deliberately keeping himself in check. He glanced up when I entered, his gaze lingering for only a second before he turned back to his coffee. "Morning," he said, voice neutral. I swallowed. "Morning." I grabbed a mug and poured myself some coffee, avoiding his eyes. But the silence between us wasn't normal. It wasn't the easy quiet from before. It was thick, heavy, with everything we weren't saying. Then, just when I thought we were going to get through breakfast without acknowledging it, Victor spoke. "About yesterday." I froze, fingers tightening around my mug. I didn't turn around. I wasn't sure I could. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. A pause, then, "It can't happen again." My stomach twisted even though I had expected those words. I forced out a short laugh. Nothing happened. Victor let out a slow breath, like he was choosing his words carefully. "That's the problem, Lucas. Nothing happened, but it almost did." I turned to face him then, ignoring the way my chest tightened at the look in his eyes. "So, what? We just pretend there's nothing here?" His jaw tensed. "There is nothing here." Liar. We both knew it. I stepped closer just enough to watch the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his grip tightened around his coffee cup. "You don't believe that." His eyes darkened, but he didn't step back. He didn't move at all. "That doesn't matter." His voice was lower now, rougher. "Because this? It's not an option." I hated how much that hurt. I should have agreed. Should have told him he was right, that we needed to stop whatever this was before it spiraled into something worse. But instead, I asked the one question I knew he wouldn't answer. "What if I don't care?" Victor's expression flickered. Just for a second, just long enough for me to see it. Want. I saw it before he forced it down, before he turned away and ran a hand through his hair like he was trying to clear his thoughts. "Lucas," he said, his voice strained. "Don't." It was a warning, but he didn't sound sure. I took another step forward, testing, pushing. "Why not?" Victor exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might snap. He turned back to me then, and for the first time, I saw it, the war happening inside him. "I'm with your mother." I swallowed hard. "I know. This is wrong." "I know." Silence. Then, finally, Victor let out a low curse and shook his head. "You don't get it, do you?" I tilted my head slightly. "Then make me understand." His eyes searched mine, and I could feel it, the exact moment he cracked. He didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't close the distance. But he didn't have to, because we both knew. It was already too late to turn back. That night, I couldn't think about anything else. The way Victor looked at me, the way his voice had faltered, the way I had felt it, this thing between us, undeniable and dangerous. And I knew he felt it too. The house was quiet when I left my room. I didn't know what I was doing. Maybe I just needed to see him. Maybe I needed him to finally admit it. I found him in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across his face. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. I closed the door behind me. "We can't keep pretending," I said. Victor's jaw tightened. "Lucas." "No." I stepped closer, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. "You want this? I want this." He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is a mistake." "Then stop me." I waited. He didn't move, didn't stop me when I stepped closer, when I reached for him, when my fingers brushed against his wrist. And then, just like that, his restraint snapped. His hands were on me in an instant, pulling me against him, his lips crashing onto mine. It wasn't slow. It wasn't gentle. It was everything we had been holding back. And it was real. The morning after, everything felt different, lighter, like the weight of keeping this secret had finally lifted. Victor sat beside me in bed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. For the first time in weeks, he looked at ease. I turned to him. "What now?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I don't want to stop." A small smile tugged at my lips. "Me neither. It wouldn't be easy. It would be messy, complicated. But I didn't care. Because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I wanted. And this time, I wasn't going to hide it.